I'm going to show some images behind me, and these were made as part of a short essay film that I made with Oliver here, who's doing the filming. And it was a film that was made out of these states that I'm going to talk about now. I'm not going to have the sound on because there's a lot of improvisation that goes on behind it. But I thought I would show it as, because it might be interesting to look at while I speak, but also because it is actually an embodiment of the states and the practices that I'm going to talk about. So, I have been a creative for many years, and I've experienced times of being stuck creatively, of being in a place where I felt insecure and afraid. And I've also experienced times of heightened inspiration. Before I became a Christian, I played and wrote songs in Elastica. This was a hedonistic scene where drugs and alcohol were freely used as a way of losing self-consciousness and accessing inspiration. After I became a Christian, using substances was no longer an option for me. And at first, I often felt creatively blocked. I found the vulnerability of the creative process terrifying. I'd also changed. The style of music I'd been making didn't resonate with me anymore. But I wasn't really sure of who I was or how to create from the new me. Over time, I began leading worship at church, and I noticed when I was playing guitar and singing, I would often feel a sense of relaxed inspiration, where my analytical mind would quieten, where I'd feel a sense of heightened ease and freedom. I realised there was something about worship, about my focus toward God, where I lost my self-consciousness, an experience similar to a flow state. I began to wonder how and where the boundaries between the aesthetic experience and the mystical experience overlapped. Often I would sing in tongues, which accessed an exhilarating sensation of spiritual intimacy. This led me to ask, how could I learn to create out of this space of worship, out of the state I experienced as a heightened communion with God? How could I let my art practice emerge from this kind of worshipful flow? Without realising, these questions led me on a journey where I began to create in a new way, to follow the inner sense of connection rather than imitating an outward style of a particular music or art. Through these processes, I began to discover correlations between the attentiveness an artist brings to their making, their love of their work, and the devotion and attentiveness we bring to God in worship. The French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil writes, "Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer." Over time, my PhD evolved to become a methodology and a rationale for accessing flow, for accessing the gifted state where self-consciousness can fall away, where creativity can become inspired play. So this is what I want to share with you today. So what is flow? The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi describes flow as a state of deep immersion, where time seems to vanish, self-consciousness fades, and one becomes completely absorbed in the act itself. It is a state so engaging and intrinsically rewarding that people will pursue it at great cost, simply for the joy of doing it. The concept of flow resonates with a range of ideas across psychology, theology, and aesthetic theory. The psychologist Maslow speaks of peak experience. And scholar Lewis Hyde highlights what he terms the gifted state, where inspiration flows as a gift received rather than produced. Hyde points out that in this inspired condition, the artist becomes a receiver rather than a creator. In this sense, the work is not consciously constructed, but comes through the artist. For Hyde, an essential portion of the artist's labour is not production, but invocation. Part of the work, he writes, must not be made, it must be received. This process, he argues, does not originate in the rational mind, but in intuition. He states, we participate in the esemplastic power of a gift by way of a particular kind of unconsciousness, unanalytic, undialectical consciousness. Hyde says it's the artist's task to create a receptive space in which inspiration can emerge. To describe the conditions for such reception, Hyde suggests the artist must create within themselves the begging bowl to which the gift is drawn. This is not a passive state, but a cultivated emptiness, a practice requiring intentional vulnerability, a readiness to receive what cannot be grasped. In this sense, gifted states are not tied to a specific craft, tradition, or aesthetic framework. Instead, they emerge through surrender and openness, an inner posture of attentiveness, dependency, and vulnerability. Hyde insists that this kind of transformation cannot be commodified, that gift operates according to a different economy than the market. He writes, usury and trade have their own growth, but they bring neither the personal transformations nor the social and spiritual cohesion of gift exchange. He suggests art becomes a true gift when it serves as a medium of transformation, when it moves beyond self-expression and becomes a vessel for something larger than the self. And Hyde extends this critique to the church, contrasting the movement of the spirit with the logic of reason alone. He states, cash exchange is to gift exchange what reason is to enthusiasm. And this reference alludes to the long-standing contrast between the enthusiasts, what today might be reflected in the charismatic Pentecostal movement, and the more rationally focused conservatives, suggesting that an artist without the gifted state is as diminished as the church neglecting the biblical gifted states, perhaps those referenced in 1 Corinthians 12. And whilst Hyde fully acknowledges the necessity of craft and discipline, he draws a sharp distinction between skill and the gift itself. He states, of course, no one is exempt from the long hours of practice, but to set out to acquire the gift itself through work is like trying to grow an extra hand or wings. It can't be done. Hyde further links the logic of the gift to that of faith, both of which require surrender rather than control. The movement of the gift, like the movement of the spirit, resists manipulation, he writes. He writes, the person who gives is a person willing to abandon control. To access the gifted state, we need to shift from a rational, goal-oriented mindset to a more intuitive and receptive way of being. The psychologist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist describes how the two hemispheres of the brain attend to the world in fundamentally different ways. The left hemisphere narrows its focus, analyses, categorises, it seeks control, certainty and utility. The right hemisphere takes in the whole, remains open, intuitive, embodied, and it beholds rather than analyses. To access flow, we often need to decenter the analytical, goal-oriented mind to allow the more receptive, relational, an intuitive mode of being to come forward. And different art forms have developed their own ways of shifting from rational control to intuitive presence. In music and performance, improvisation bypasses the slower step-by-step logic of the rational mind, drawing on more immediate subconscious responses. And this demands trust in body knowledge, in feel rather than thought. It relies heavily on procedural memory, knowing embedded in the body, not in the intellect. And pianist Kenny Werner highlights the importance of surrender. He states, in this space, playing becomes less an act of control and more an act of reception, more like taking dictation from within. And similarly, Stephen Nachmanovich writes, as an improvising musician, I'm not in the music business, I'm not in the creativity business, I'm in the surrender business. Music therapist Evan Rood likens this surrendered flow to speaking in tongues. He writes, stream of consciousness is often attached to creative improvisation and often interpreted as stream of unconsciousness, in the sense that it is close to a meditative process, a kind of artistic glossolalia. Within the craft of writing, spontaneous writing operates by a similar underlying mechanism. It short-circuits rational control to allow a deeper and more intuitive material to emerge. The teacher and artist Julia Cameron, in her book The Artist's Way, advocates the writing of morning pages. 3 hands of longhand stream of consciousness writing, first thing in the morning, in order to clear the mind and unleash creativity. Through temporarily bypassing the critical editing mind, grammar, coherence, and linear argument are suspended to allow language to flow freely, often revealing underlying emotional or subconscious material. Or perhaps what Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain calls the spiritual preconscious, that liminal space where God can speak, where intuition and inspiration can arise. And in filming or photography, flow can be accessed through attentive looking, through beholding what Christine Walters Paintner calls the slow, loving gaze. And beholding is not analytical looking or critique. It's not looking for something, but letting the thing reveal itself. Rather than rushing to interpret or control what is seen, the observer waits on the image, allowing it to disclose itself in its own time. This halts the rational mind's urge to categorize, to judge, opening space for intuitive receptivity. Like improvisation, beholding requires attentiveness, a sustained, open and patient awareness. This kind of looking is a devotional act. The gaze becomes a site of encounter rather than control. Deep beholding can dissolve the boundary between subject and object, between the one who sees and what is seen. There comes a moment when the distinction between them disappears, where the two feel indistinguishable. This also happens with drawing, and Betty Edwards talks about shift into right brain thinking, upside down drawing. And when an image is flipped upside down, the left brain, focused on logic and language, essentially disengages, allowing the right brain, better at seeing shapes and spatial relationships, to take over. And each of these practices at their foundation demand surrender, a letting go of a part of the self that would prefer to keep control. This might mean we end up looking a bit foolish. When we lay down craft and let flow take over, what is produced can often seem not as proficient. This can wound the ego. We want people to like our work, to see us as talented, to think we're good at what we do. Yet the ego must go through this process to help ourselves get out of the way so that something deeper, more authentic can start to speak. This requires surrendering any grasp for acclaim, for posterity, for success. We need to let go of the need to prove ourselves, the part of us that desires validation. This can be a form of taking our art practice through the cross. This ethos of relinquishment also appears in Allen Ginsberg's Reflections on the Poetic Process. Quoted by Hyde, Ginsberg articulates the radical depth of creative surrender. He declares, "It means abandoning being a poet, abandoning your careerism, abandoning the possibility of expressing yourself to the nations of the world. You really have to make a resolution just to write for yourself. Not writing to impress yourself, but just writing what yourself is saying." And this ego surrender, this death to the self, emerges as an essential part of the creative process. For Christians, this should not come as a surprise. It is foundational to the Christian story that resurrection comes only through the cross. In the same way, an artist's work gains transformative potency only by passing through this process. Without such surrender, the work might take the appearance of art, but lack power to transform. It risks becoming a cliche, something predictable, or something sentimental. Jeremy Begbie writes in regards Christian art, "Christian sentimentalism arises from a premature grasp for Easter morning, a refusal to follow the 3 days of Easter as 3 days in an irreversible sequence of victory over evil." And this kind of daily death to self isn't loss, it's gain. We become most ourselves precisely when we stop trying to be successful, when we stop trying to be a somebody. We need to move from being creative director to becoming a channel for God to use. In a world obsessed with productivity, this is radical. But it's also where some of the most meaningful and transformative experiences are found. In this view, flow is not just a psychological state, it is a spiritual orientation. Improvisation isn't about making things up, it's about getting out of the way, listening deeply and responding truthfully. And perhaps one of the most overlooked yet powerful practices for accessing flow is the practice of speaking in tongues. Though sometimes dismissed by those outside the charismatic or Pentecostal sphere as irrational or chaotic, speaking in tongues can be understood as a deeply embodied, intuitive and flow-inducing spiritual discipline. Theologian Richard Bayer's perspective on glossolalia resonates with this idea, suggesting that these practices allow the analytical mind to rest, freeing other dimensions of a person for a deeper openness to divine reality. And Bayer's insight is key. In tongues, the rational, critical faculties are set aside. You're not constructing sentences, controlling meaning, or editing your output. Instead, language flows directly from a place beneath or beyond cognition, a stream of syllables directly from the heart, communicating spirit to spirit. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 14:2, "For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit." And this act of spiritual expression is presented as beneficial for individual edification, as Paul further notes in 1 Corinthians 14:4. Speaking in tongues heightens intuitive receptivity. By stepping out of analytical thought into the receptive, we open ourselves in a new way to the voice of the Spirit. And this is why tongues are so often linked to prophetic listening. The practice softens the dominance of the analytical mind, allowing subtle impressions, images, and inner promptings to surface. In this way, speaking in tongues becomes a kind of spiritual communion, a devotional flow state where surrender becomes a gateway to communion. And like artistic flow, the value is not in understanding it as it happens, but in what it opens up, in the space it creates for listening, for encounter, and for transformation. So practicing flow, as with speaking in tongues, can help us to become a receptive channel through which God can touch the world. It can shift our art from striving and self-doubt, from needing external validation, to a practice rooted in joy, authenticity, and a sense of intimacy or communion with God. When we're no longer driven by ego, fear, or the need to be a successful artist, we become vessels, open, present, and attuned to the Spirit. The art that flows from this place carries a different kind of presence. It's not just self-expression, it becomes an act of service. And in many ways, much of what I've shared today goes against what we might think it means to be a successful artist. But the kingdom of God runs counter to the values of the world. When we die to the need for success, recognition, or validation, we gain access to something deeper, a place of creative play where the process itself becomes the reward, a place where dying to self opens us up to be used by God for the sake of others. This doesn't mean we let go of craft or give up honing our artistic skills. It might just mean we add the skill of practicing flow to our artistic toolkit. We no longer have to rely on technical perfection alone or to judge our practice through the lens of worldly success. But by continually allowing our art practice to go through the cross, maybe becoming willing to look foolish or even to look like a failure, is how we make room for resurrection and transformation through our practice. And this is the paradox of the cross. When we surrender our lives, we find them. When we stop using our art to promote ourselves, it can become an act of service that God empowers for the building up of others. Thank you.